3 out of 5 users or the majority of users? Which one's better? So this question comes from Ruth, who was on a 5-day user research bootcamp that I was running last week. It's aimed at early stage user researchers. And the question Ruth asked was this: when reporting the results of a usability test, should I say 3 of 5 users experienced a problem, or the majority of users experienced the problem? Now, I thought this was an interesting question because I think that actually there's a better way of doing it than either of those. But first of all, let's compare the two of those as alternatives. So one reason why you might want to say the majority of users is because basically you want to hide how many people were in your usability test, and you feel a little bit embarrassed in saying there was only 5. If I say the majority, it makes it sound like it was more of them than it actually was. A reason why you might say 3 out of 5 is because you want to be honest and say, yeah, it's a small sample usability test. We only tested 5 people, but 3 of those people experienced the problem. I think neither of those really are the best way of describing it, because there's an implicit assumption when you give numbers or you talk about the majority of people in a qualitative study that the number of users that experienced a problem somehow means that it's correlated with the severity of the problem. In other words, if everybody experienced a problem, of course it's worse than one that only affects one person. And I don't think that's true. So for example, Ruth is working on government systems. Let's say that we had a form on a government system which asked somebody for their address, and one of our users struggles with that particular field requirement because they're homeless. Now clearly, although it's affected a small number of people in our test, that's a really important problem because suddenly the service is inaccessible to that person, even though it affected just one of our 5 participants. Now, let's say we had another problem. Let's say we were working on a jobs website, and one of the questions we had on our form asked people about their job history, and we might have a field label that says title, and what we're interested in was their job title. So for example, user experience designer or business analyst or cashier or whatever, but we discover that people, when they come across that field, they enter Mr. or Mrs. or Doctor or whatever. In other words, they misinterpret the field label. Let's say everybody experiences that problem. Is that a worse problem than the earlier one where somebody can't complete it because they can't enter their address? I'd say no. I say that you can't just use the number of people that experienced a problem as a criterion for saying how severe that problem is. We also need to focus on a really other important characteristic, which is task completion. Problems that stop people completing their tasks are much more important than problems where people need to backtrack or it slows them down generally, but they can still complete the task. So I'd say don't express your data in either of those ways. But there's a more important reason, I think, for saying that as well, which is that you're undermining your confidence in your own qualitative data. Don't go around quantifying your qualitative data. It's qualitative data. Celebrate the fact that it's qualitative data and it gives you insights. Don't try and pretend there's some kind of quantitative way of looking at it, because it looks like you're being an apologist for that kind of data. Now, there's one exception there, and that's where I'm doing a summative usability test. Let's say that I run a summative usability test and 15 out of 20 people, because I would be using larger samples, are successful on the task. Clearly, that statistic would come out as 75% as people being successful. However, I wouldn't describe it as 75% successful. I would say in our usability test, the task completion rate was somewhere between 58% and 82% using the adjusted Wald method. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I'll put a link to a calculator down in the description. In other words, even with large-ish samples, like 20 in a usability test, which is a reasonably large sample for a usability test, I still wouldn't use the precise numbers there. Instead, I would provide the range. I would describe, using probability, where I think the task completion rate would sit within that. Well, that's my answer to the question. I'm curious how you might answer it as well. Please leave a comment below and let me know.